We're getting sophisticated here.
All right. Thanks for coming. I'm Gavin. This is the fourth service, right? And maybe next time, keep an eye on the Facebook page. We'll probably have another venue, maybe a better one, where I think this will start to improve with having better access, better parking options. We'll see what kind of room there is, but I assume it'll be probably an improvement. So today we've got a couple of things, and one, Justin is going to try something new towards the end, moderated discussion. But with that, Chris?
Yeah. So to start, Steve asked me to do a reading. So I'm going to read from a text called Discourse on Voluntary Servitude. This is from a French author, named Stolte. And he wrote about why one person or a small group of people is able to rule over a large group of people, despite the numbers of people obviously being so off balance. So, it amazes us to hear accounts of the valor that liberty arouses in the hearts of those who defend it. But who could believe reports of what goes on every day among the inhabitants of some countries? Who could really believe that one man alone may mistreat 100,000 and deprive them of their liberty? Who would credit such a report if he merely heard it, without being present to witness the event? And if this condition occurred only in distant lands and were reported to us, which one among us would not assume the tale to be imagined or invented? Obviously, there is no need of fighting to overcome this single tyrant, for he is automatically defeated if the country refuses to consent to its own enslavement. It is not necessary to deprive him of anything, but simply to give him nothing. There is no need that the country may make an effort to do anything for itself, provided it does nothing against itself. It is therefore the inhabitants themselves who permit, or rather bring about, their own subjection, since by ceasing to submit, they would put an end to their servitude. A people enslaves itself, cuts its own throat, when having its choice between being vassals and being free men, it deserts its liberties and takes on the yoke, gives consent to its own misery, or rather, apparently welcomes it. Everyone knows that the fire from a little spark will increase and blaze ever higher as long as it finds wood to burn, yet without being quenched by water, but merely by finding no more fuel to feed on. It consumes itself, dies down, and is no longer aflame. Similarly, the more tyrants pillage, the more they crave, the more they ruin and destroy, the more one yields to them and obeys them. By that much do they become mightier and more formidable, the readier to annihilate and destroy. But if not one thing is yielded to them, if without any violence they are simply not obeyed, they become naked and undone and as nothing, just as when the root receives no nourishment, the branch withers and dies. Poor, wretched, and stupid peoples, nations determined on your own misfortune and blind you to your own good. You let yourselves be deprived before your own eyes of the best part of your revenues. Your fields are plundered, your homes robbed, your family heirlooms taken away. You live in such a way that you cannot claim a single thing as your own, and it would seem that you consider yourselves lucky to be loaned your property, your families, and your very lives. All this havoc, this misfortune, this ruin, descends upon you not from alien foes, but from the one enemy whom you yourselves render as powerful as he is, for whom you go bravely to war, for whose greatness you do not refuse to offer your own bodies unto death. So next up we have, Steve, are you up next?
Well, we're going to take a minute to chat. So.
All right. So, since we have one new face here today, take a moment to go ahead and meet your neighbor and make sure that you said hello to everyone.
Hi, how are you this week?
Hi, Steve.
I like your,
Good to see you.
you wore your religious jewelry.
I know.
Yeah.
Very appropriate.
Hello.
Hi. Hi, how are you?
How you doing?
Retired?
How are you?
Not too bad.
I think you should have to stand up and tell us all about yourself.
Because you know that's really hard to get me to talk about myself.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. We do have to break for lunch and at some point.
Steve, I was wondering, so were you raised in a religion at all, or which faith were you?
Snake handlers, not.
I know snake handling. My father was a Christian of some sort, probably Baptist, but I say that because my mother was such a strong agnostic or atheist that he kept that part of himself sort of hidden while she was alive, and then started attending services and doing a musical show after she died a few years ago. But so I was, we never went to church really when I was a kid. I had friends who went to church. Occasionally I'd go with them just to see what it was. And of course, anytime you come into a religion and you see, for example, I remember the people being, this was Baptist, people being called down, walking down the aisle to recommit themselves to Jesus. And I remember seeing like the milkman, that I knew, the guy who would drive a milk truck around. I remember seeing, he's doing this, and it's interesting that people are doing this in public. The religious services that I knew, mostly though, when I was really little, were I went to an Episcopal private school because that was private school, and they would do terrible things to me at the public school, which I didn't tell people about. And so we would have once a week we would go in for the Episcopal services there. So I had a little bit of the pageantry sort of.
Right.
Some ways similar to Catholics, and stained glass windows and all that sort of thing. And then when I was older, I did go to Baptist church. Mainly the camaraderie, the having the extended family was the main attraction there. But they were tolerant of me bringing up theological points during Sunday school and saying, no, this is not, wait a minute, now my Bible has a footnote here that says this was mistranslated in the King James Version. How do you explain that? They didn't have a problem with me bringing those things up, and I ended up actually getting elected to be what's called a messenger to the Southern Baptist Convention, which is like a delegate a couple of times. So I was involved in that, and then so that's mainly my religious experience. I'm sort of, I guess agnostic would be the best thing. I look at different religions and I see points that people make, and I look at quantum physics and realize, well, there is some rational basis for believing in sort of a level of reality beyond what's visible to the eye. So I'm interested in exploring all that, and probably I took those little online tests, and the Unitarians. And there are a lot of Buddhists, I guess, were the groups that popped up as things I might be interested in when I took this computer test.
There's an online test?
Yeah, it's BelieveNet.
You can get the Church of Praxeology in there.
So those are the closest, but that was based on filling out the questionnaire, and then they tell you what you might be interested in. So that's my confused religious background. I did because I was a candidate for office statewide, and
All of a sudden you're going to church every week.
well, no,
I'm fervent in Jesus Christ.
No, it was more that I got to meet people from the different groups, the snake handlers, and the people who would speak in tongues, and the people in various denominations and so forth. And so that was so I did, and that was an interesting experience. I learned a lot about different religious groups through that. And then, as I was mentioning a while ago, my main employers for the last 30 years have been Catholics. So I've worked for 4 famous people in politics, and for some reason, it's just total coincidence, all of them have been Catholics. So I've been exposed to Catholicism at least through working for them as well. So that's my confused and disparate religious background.
Yeah, I went to a church service a couple of weeks ago where it was just talking about Bible passages, and they actually had who has a King James Bible, who has this Bible, and everyone had, so they would actually encourage the different versions to talk about different interpretations, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I like to go back and actually go through the commentaries where they would say that this passage was not written at the time.
This word in Greek says
right.
This.
This section was probably added in the 3rd century by a translator, and so on. So I was always interested in that kind
Okay, well, let's just go on with my speech. So what I'm going to talk about today is to present another hero of the Church of Praxeology. And the idea behind this is we try to find historical figures whose lives represent the values we're trying to promote and draw them out, talk about them, and sort of try to abstract some lessons we can use for our own life. And so far we've done David Henry Thoreau and Percy Shelley and his family. And today I'd like to talk about John Brown, which maybe people have heard about, maybe they haven't. John Brown was, if you don't know who he was an abolitionist who lived in the 1800s. He was born in 1800 and he died in 1859, and he died at the hands of the state of militia. He was hanged, and he was executed as a result of his most famous act, which was his raid on Harper's Ferry, which had happened just a month or so before. And his raid on Harper's Ferry is what he's most well known for, and I think that's appropriate because it was really the summation of his life. It was the sort of what he had been working towards his entire life. And so what I'd like to do is tell you about who he was, talk to you about Harper's Ferry, and then try to draw out some lessons from his life. So who is John Brown? Like I said, he was born in 1800, and he died in 1859. And I think the best way to tell you about who the man was would just, instead of going chronologically through his life, is just to talk about some themes of his life. So one of the things I think is critical to understand about John Brown is his life is really a story of riches to rags. He was very successful early in his life. His father had been a tanner, and so he learned the tannery business. And he went out on his own early in his life, bought a farm, started a tannery, and became very successful. They say when he was in his mid-20s, he was employing 15 people already, which in those days was a pretty substantial enterprise because the economy was much less specialized. Most people were sort of family farmers, or maybe they were artisans of some sort, but they didn't have as much capital then. So to employ 15 people meant you were doing very well. And during this period of his life, when he was still young, in his late teens up to his early 30s, he experienced what it was like to be sort of a pillar of his community. He was the guy who had a very stable life. He had a large and growing family. He would eventually sire 20 children with 2 different wives. And he had the material wherewithal to participate in community events. He was that guy whose opinion that people respected and whose advice they asked for, and sort of a leader of his community. So he was, for example, he started a school. He was a surveyor for the roads. He started the post office, became the postmaster of his small town. And so all these things kind of, he knew what that was like. It was sort of like he had reached this point in his life, which many people strive for, maybe to get when they're much older, or maybe they never get to. He had experienced when he was in his 20s. And I think having that experience gave him I don't know if confidence is the right word, but as time passed and his fortunes deteriorated, he knew what he was giving up. And I think it was partly a conscious decision in his part not to work to try to get back to that same position after his fortunes had some bad turns. And what you see is his fortunes did decline, and towards the end of his life, the last 15 years, 10 years of his life, he's basically penniless, and he has this large family, but he doesn't have, he's living hand to mouth. And I think partly it was a choice because he was known to be a competent worker and intelligent man. But what you see is this decline in his material fortunes, but you see a corresponding increase in what I think was like his spiritual life, because the last decade of his life, he was fanatical about the abolition of slavery, and that was pretty much what he was spending all of his time on. So there's sort of these 2 trends that are going on. Now, another thing that you need to know about John Brown, which anyone who knew the man would probably tell you is maybe the first thing that you need to know about him, was how devoted he was to his religion. He was a very pious man. He had been raised in a Calvinist family that could trace its roots back to the original settlers of Massachusetts that came on the Mayflower. And he exhibited all the characteristics you would expect from somebody who's, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He was very prudent with his money, frugal and hardworking, not given to frivolity, all these things. And he actually took it to a sort of an extreme degree. So he's the type of person who probably sometimes was sort of irritating to be around because he was so dogmatic. Like, for example, he would take the Sabbath very seriously. He wouldn't let people visit him on the Sabbath. He would spend the day in going to service and reading the Bible and discussing the Bible with his family. Another thing, like a business partner of his once said, John Brown weaves Scripture in and out of his conversation with such facility, sometimes you don't even know he's quoting Scripture. So just to give you an idea about how top of mind the word, the Bible was, and how much he was thinking about it. And whether you agree with his belief, whether you're a Calvinist, or you have to respect that he committed to it. And it wasn't something that he just lived when it was convenient. It was something he lived all the time. And when it was hard and when it was easy. So just to give you an example, there's a story that I think really encapsulates who the man was, which was told by his oldest son, who's also John, that I think will give you a good idea about the man's character. So for a while, when John Brown Jr. was young, his father had him record all of his sins, and John Brown, like many people in his time, believed in corporal punishment, because that's the Bible said. There's a passage, for example, spare the rod, spoil the child. And anyway, so he had his son keep a ledger of his sins, and each sin would have a certain number of lashes associated with it. So for example, lying, 7 lashes, mouthing off 5 lashes or whatever. And then if he did good deeds, then he would have lashes taken away. And at one point, John Brown says to his son, John, your account is hopelessly overdrawn. We need to settle it. And so they went out to the barn, and he had his son cut a sapling to whip him with. And they go in the barn and they have a short conversation. John Brown says to his son, are there any good deeds that are not recorded here that we can use to take some of these off? And his son couldn't think of any. And then he says, well, do you have any better explanations about why you committed these sins that we can use to lessen the punishment? And his son couldn't come up with any. And basically, finally, John Brown Jr. was like, I'm owed these. So his father starts whipping him, and he gets, after about 8, John Brown Jr. realizes through his tears that his father has stopped whipping him. And he turns around and says to his father, Father, why have you stopped? And his father says, I can't do it. I can't do this anymore. But somebody committed these sins were committed, and a punishment is owed. And I'm your father. I'm partly responsible. And so he took his shirt off and gave the sapling to his son, and had his son whip him the remaining 17 lashes until his back was bleeding, because he wouldn't let him do it lightly. So I mean, it's kind of an absurd, taking it to an absurd level, but you can see that he believed that there's a law, and everyone has to follow the law, including himself. And so I think you have to respect that to a certain degree. So from his piety, from his belief in Christianity and God and the Bible, naturally came his ideas about abolition. He believed that blacks were people, and they had souls created by God, and that he believed in the golden rule: do unto others as you have them do unto you, and that we should be our brother's keeper. And so from an early age, he saw slavery as a abhorrent in the face of God, and he fought to end it. And he said he first became an abolitionist when he was 12. He became friends with a young black man who was a slave, and who John Brown, being the self-critical person he was, realized that there are many things about this person that are in his character that are superior to me. So anyway, they became friends, and after a couple days, John Brown saw this youth's master turn on him for some minor transgression and start beating him with a shovel. And John Brown was just shocked by that because, this was another person worthy of respect. And to see that, someone could just start hitting him with a shovel. So he said he became an abolitionist that day. And his whole life is a story of really grappling with the issue of not is slavery wrong or right, he decided that, but more, how do you actually end it? And so he tries all these different things. So for example, he was very involved in the Underground Railroad. When he built his first farmhouse in his early 20s, there was a barn he built, and he designed a hidden room to shelter slaves. And throughout his life, he was sheltering them. Sometimes he would bring them to Canada, or he would move them wherever they needed to go. This was something that he was always doing, and that was actually a pretty big risk because that was a serious crime those days. You'd get in a lot of trouble for that. Another thing, like when in the mid-40s, he moved his whole family to Springfield, Massachusetts. Springfield, Massachusetts was sort of a hotbed of abolitionist thought, and he joined a interracial church there. And there he met Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, amongst others, as well as meeting a lot of town luminaries whose contacts would help him later as he planned for Harper's Ferry. And it was interesting because Frederick Douglass made the comment about how John Brown acted around black people. It wasn't like most abolitionists acted around black people. He didn't act condescendingly, nor was he overly solicitous. He actually was able to just see through the color of their skin. And this was something that Frederick Douglass remarked on. You go to dinner at John Brown's house, and the children are excited because there's guests, but you're not a curiosity as a black man. And he would sometimes be critical of blacks. Sometimes he would be, it was just, he didn't see it. And you have to ask, like, how did he get to that point? And I think it is because this was a man who lives his convictions, and he knew what his convictions were, and he lived them every day. And a man like that, if he decides, his conviction says everyone's equal, then that's it. That's how he's going to live. So I think that's sort of a telling statement from Frederick Douglass. But anyway, so continuing on with things he did, he moved. There was a Fugitive Slave Act passed in 1850, and it was part of the Compromise of 1850, which basically said if any runaway slaves are discovered in the North, the person who discovers them and reports them to the federal government will get a bounty. This was, hated by the abolitionists, obviously. And John Brown formed a militia in Springfield of all the freed slaves there, basically committed to defending any slaves if a bounty hunter came to try and take them away. And they were very militant. And whether or not it was because of that or some other reason, the fact is that no runaway slaves who were living in Springfield were ever sent back to the South in the decade from the Fugitive Slave Act to the Civil War, despite the fact that it was known as a hotbed and a refuge for runaway slaves. So then a couple of years goes by, and he hears about this wealthy landowner in upstate New York who has this plan of granting land for slaves if they want to start a farm. And so John Brown thinks this is a great idea. Maybe this can be something where if this could take off, it could help the movement. So he decides to move his whole family to upstate New York because he was an expert in animal husbandry, and he was a pretty decent farmer too. So he thought he could lend a hand. And again, just to show you, this was a commitment of his life, and he actually just moved his whole family up there to try to help this community get off the ground. A couple of years goes by, and some of his sons, who are now grown, decide they're going to move to Kansas. There was this issue called Bleeding Kansas. There was a question about whether Kansas was going to be a free state or a slave state. So some people who wanted the land moved there. Maybe they were believing it should be free, and then some slave people moved there thinking it should be slave. And what happened is a lot of these rough border ruffians from Missouri started going across into Kansas, harassing and threatening and sometimes even murdering the people who believed in it should be a free state because they wanted to bring it into the side of slavery. And what happened is John Brown heard about this. His sons had settled down there, and he decided to go join. And they basically got together and said, you know, we need to send a message to these people that we're not just going to let them do this peaceably. The free state advocates, generally, when this would happen, they would appeal to the government, the federal government. And the federal government was pretty much controlled by the slave power. And so it was such a touchy subject that they wouldn't try to lend a hand. They just let it continue. So John Brown and his sons get together, and they actually start doing their own raids. And one night, they famously killed 5 or 6 of these thugs who had been menacing and threatening the lives of these free state people around them. You got to understand, it was so chaotic. I mean, there would be free cities, like Lawrence, Kansas, was a free city, and then there'd be slave cities just a couple miles away. So it really became like a civil war. And anyway, their efforts, then this militia grew until he had several dozen people, and their efforts really put fear into the people who were marginally slave, promoters of slave. So all these people started saying, well, hey, wait a second, they're actually going to fight back. And what happened is they all everyone petitioned the federal government, and the federal government finally decided to come in and neutralize it. So he had some success then. And he became really well known. It was Potawatomi John Brown, as like somebody who just brought fear to, you know, people who were promoting slavery. And so now he had a reputation, and that set him up for his final act of his life, which was what happened at Harper's Ferry. And the more I read about Harper's Ferry, the more I think it was an act of just pure genius and originality, and only something that John Brown could have come up with. And only someone who had struggled with this issue for several decades could have thought of and imagined and actually executed. And it really did change the course of history. So let me just tell you, the details in case you don't know. Harper's Ferry, this is a plan that John Brown had for a long time, which was, he always talked about taking the fight to Africa, which meant actually going into the South and trying to free slaves or do something there. But he hadn't really made a concrete plan. But now that he had a reputation, he could go to the people, some backers in the East, who would give him money sort of sight unseen because they didn't want to know what he was doing. And so he got some money together, and he got some people together. Some of his sons freed slaves and other abolitionists. They had about 24 people. And their plan was to invade Harper's Ferry, Virginia, take over the federal armory there. And the federal armory had more than 100,000 rifles and muskets. And they were going to capture the armory and then start going around to local farms and arming these slaves and asking them to join, freeing them and arming them and asking them to join this army. And the idea was that they were going to go farm to farm, freeing slaves and then county by county. And then eventually this army would just be a wave that was going to grow. They were going to go down the Shenandoah Valley and into the Deep South and basically liberate all the slaves. So now we know it failed. They did capture the armory, and that was pretty much the extent of it. Within 36 hours, the federal troops arrived and captured him, and then he was executed just a few weeks later. So it didn't work out. And you might say, well, what's so genius about that? Because it's obviously a failed enterprise. I mean, and what happened is, it is true that tactically it was a failure, but strategically it was actually a great success. So you have to understand the slaveholding mentality. The biggest fear, the deepest and darkest fear in the South was that there would be a revolt by the slaves. And that, in some places slaves outnumbered whites 2, 3, 4 to 1. And they knew if the slaves were able to get a little bit of power, that it could grow very quickly. And it had happened once before. There was this black preacher called Nat Turner in 1831 in Virginia who had said God had ordained for him to free his people. Started a revolt. And before it was suppressed, more than 4 white people had been killed. So it was already a very, very deeply rooted terror in the South that something like that could happen. And what happened is, it seems like John Brown discovered this. He understands the psychology so well of the slaveholders, that, you know, he realized this is a fault line that runs through Southern society, and all that needs to be done is just to tap it.